there! I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week and a half in reading. The first thing that I finished off during this period was Craig Thompson's Blankets, which is a massive graphic memoir about the author-artists growing up in a evangelical Christian household in a rural area and with a family history of sexual abuse. And this is more or less his coming of age and a look at his first real relationship and the relationship that he had with the family of his first girlfriend. The art is, it has a classic kind of black and white line art style to it with a lot of shading. I liked the art style enough that it distracted me from the fact that this book is not nearly as reflective as I think the author thinks it is. It reminded me a little bit of Tillie Walden's Spinning, because that was similarly a very looking backwards reflective memoir, but because she wrote that at such a young age, and she was I think 21 or 22 when she wrote that book, that there wasn't really enough time for reflection. Craig Thompson was I think 28 when he wrote this, but it still doesn't seem like there was enough time in between them. So when he gets to the end, and the final point in this is that he's left his family's faith and become his own person, but there wasn't a lot of connection and there wasn't a lot to the journey. So while it was interesting, I didn't feel like it was nearly as deep as some of the reflections at the end seemed to think that the journey had been. Because while there were some interesting and unique bits to his journey, there wasn't really enough going on to give it that extra depth. So I definitely appreciated this from an artistic perspective, but I don't think it was nearly as powerful as the author was aiming for. And given some of the glowing reviews I've heard of this, I expected this to be a lot deeper than it was. But it was still nice to look at. Next up, I read Jhumpa Lahiri's In Other Words, which is more or less a project that she undertook where she had been studying Italian in a casual way for 20 years and decided to move her family to Italy and only write in Italian for a couple of years. And this book is the result of that. She did not translate this herself. This was translated by Anne Goldstein. And I thought that was an interesting choice because it means that she couldn't edit it into her own English style. So it becomes something very distinct. So there's something a little more simple to the writing than there is to her English writing, just by virtue of the difference in fluency. The book basically consists of a series of essays and a couple of short stories. The stories are not great, but they're interesting examples of how one can write creatively within a kind of limited range of fluency. And I think the essays are similar in that they are more interesting than they are good writing. So it's, for lack of a better word, it's neat to see someone who is very famous for writing in one language go and write in a language in which they are not fluent. But at the same time, if what you're normally a fan of is craft and you want to see someone who crafts their writing very carefully, it's not going to be the same experience when they're writing in a language that they are not quite fluent in. So I didn't think it was nearly as powerful as it maybe could have been, because I'm definitely always fascinated by writers who, for example, translate their own work, like Nancy Houston or Andre Brink or Elif Shafak, because I think that's an interesting statement about the way language and writing and the poetry of language works differently in different languages, but that's not what this is doing. This is just her experience learning a language, which is interesting, but it's a little more generic than I think one would hope from someone who's as well known as she is. I'm not convinced that this is significantly different from what anyone who is having that kind of language learning experience would have. And I don't know if that's fair or not, but that was kind of the impression that I came away with. Still, I do think there's something inspirational about it, because I do know a lot of people who have studied a language casually and have never hit the fluency level that would enable them to write like that, and I think this would be very inspiring if you're in that situation, because it does say, look, if you put in this extra effort to really immerse yourself in the language and culture, you can get there. So I mean, that was nice. But yeah, overall, it was more interesting than good, I would say. After that, I read a children's book, and that is The War That Saved My Life by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley. In terms of style, this could almost be aimed at even younger than middle grade kids, but in terms of content, it almost would be on the older side of that. This tells the story of a girl who lives with her horrifically abusive single mother in basically a slum in London in 1940. The Blitz is imminent, and she and her younger brother are evacuated to a town. I was going to say a town in the country because that's the cliche, but no, they go to Kent. And basically it's unraveling the incredible amount of trauma this girl has, both psychologically and physically, because she was born with a club foot and never had any kind of corrective action taken for that. So she's much more significantly disabled than she needs to be, and has to deal with the reactions to people who are asking her, why are you on crutches? And they react by, well, why haven't they done something about that? And then the side story is that she, in the same way that she's healing in this family that she's staying with, that she's similarly helping this woman whose friend, I think we're meant to assume partner, has passed away recently, so there's a lot of, this was something that belonged to her. So yeah, it's a book about both war and healing. I was surprised at how this managed to walk the line of not being too graphic for a child to read, but still being very honest about these incredibly harsh topics of this girl and her brother and how abused they were. The woman they're staying with and her mourning and not being able to mourn properly, I think, because obviously she's closeted and it's the 40s. And the whole situation within the country, because as they progress through the story, obviously Kent is actually bombed before London is, so there's a complicated situation with that. So I was very impressed with it. Yeah, this did a lot, and I was not at all expecting it to do nearly as much as it did. So yeah, impressive. There is a sequel to this, and I'm gonna get that at the library and see how that is, because I'll be curious to see if they can continue pulling off this kind of balance. Next up, I took another one of my forays into genres that I don't normally follow, and I picked up a very straightforward Harlequin romance in the form of Jennifer Lohman's Winning Ruby Heart, which I picked up because I heard it was very track and field, athletics focused, and I wanted to see what kind of take we would have on that, because I often make fun of the romances that I read because I don't think they always do a great job, because they are a genre that's similar to whodunits within mystery that is extremely formulaic, and a lot of authors, I think, get lazy and just plug certain things into the formula. So I was reading this expecting to make fun of it, and instead I was actually really impressed with everything that this did, even though it sticks to the formula, absolutely. So we have the couple, they don't like each other, then they fall in love with each other, they hook up, but they have to break up for some external reason, and then they get back together and live happily ever after. So it does exactly that. It's not a spoiler to say that, because this is the super romance line, which promises you that you're going to have a happy ending. But everything that was plugged into it surprised me, up until the very end where it kind of went off the rails. But I think this style of romance, again, as with whodunits, tends to do that at the end. This is about a female middle distance runner who was stripped of Olympic medals after she was caught for doping, and her relationship with the reporter who first brought her shame to the public, and now it's 5 years later, and he wants to profile her. Her time being banned from sport is just up, so she's getting into ultra marathons, and he's accidentally runs into her and wants to do a follow-up piece. It sounds a little cheesy, but there was a surprising amount of social commentary in this about the way female athletes are treated versus male athletes, and about the way people who mess up, how the reactions on social media go towards that, and how the redemption arcs that get created by the media differ between men and women, and how different types of athletes are reacted to differently. There are comments about how her situation would compare to baseball players and cyclists, and I was really surprised at how well that was done, because I think that is something that would have been easy to skim over, but it got into a lot of interesting cultural attitudes towards sport in there. And not just regarding her, but also regarding the reporter. He is a former college football player who broke his back in a tackle gone wrong. So over the past 10 years, he moved into sports reporting instead. And so it also gets into the assumptions about both the physicality and the level of agency that somebody with a really visible physical disability would have, both in the media and in general in life. And again, I was incredibly surprised because it pulled all of that off really well. I wouldn't go into a formulaic romance expecting a lot of intelligent social commentary about gender and disability, and yet here we go. It was entertaining. And surprisingly, the sex scenes were not super cringeworthy, which they often are in books like this. So yeah, I was impressed. And then finally, switching genres again, I read Samantha Schweblin's Fever Dream. This was translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. I heard this described as a literary horror novel, and I was curious to see what that would be. And it's a great description, actually. This is very interestingly written in that when you get into the beginning, it's completely baffling. It is not straightforward, and it's challenging to figure out what's going on. And eventually, it becomes clear that there is a woman talking to a boy, but whether the boy is really there, whether he's a ghost, whether he's a hallucination, who knows? The woman is dying. She might be in a hospital. She might be hallucinating somewhere. Maybe she's already dead. Who knows? But she's telling the story of how she's come to that point to this boy, who occasionally will tell her, no, don't tell that part of the story, that's not important, and go on to something else. In terms of mood, this was incredible. I can't even think of anything else I've read that is as atmospheric and creepy as this was. It is really disturbing to read. It's uncomfortable because there's so much that's unknown, and you have to keep guessing at what might be happening. And every now and then the woman will say something that sounds like she's going to lead you to an answer, but the boy will tell her that that part's not important, so she'll have to move on to something else. So it was fascinating that way. It was really brilliant in terms of creating that mood. My first reaction upon finishing this was that this was just incredibly brilliant. Now, the more I think about it, the more I think the ending is a little bit unsatisfactory because it suffers from a problem that I think a lot of horror films have, in that if you show the monster, and there isn't really a monster in this, but just metaphorically, I guess. If you show the monster, it's disappointing because it's never as scary as what's in your head. But if you never show the monster, there's a certain lack of satisfaction because how scary can it be if you don't even know if it exists? And this suffers a bit from that second one in that it is never completely clear what has happened, and it's fantastic in the moment, but when you think back on it, it makes it a little bit empty, but still the experience of reading this was absolutely brilliant. And I wholeheartedly recommend this to basically everyone because it was incredibly successful in terms of setting mood and keeping that kind of creepiness. Just great stuff. And it's less than 200 pages, so you have no excuse not to pick this up. It was fantastic. So yeah, that was my week. I know this weekend is the Get Graphic readathon, so I don't know if you're reading comics. If you are, I think one of their prompts is to read one that's 500 pages, and this one is over 500 pages if you wanted to pick that up. Anyway, I hope you had a good week. That's it for now. Ciao.